And in Provocations, students are basically invited to respond to questions that will lead them to formulate basically a position and a project. It's very early in the semester still. We are talking about big ideas, big topics, and basically Provocations is a fantastic introduction to kind of opening up and seeing what lies for everyone in the future. So there are also 4 simultaneous workshops today. They are focusing on topics such as ecology, narratives, social equity, and technology. And we are here in the technology workshop. So basically, we are focusing on technology, and our guest for today is Casey Rehm. I will introduce you just for everyone who doesn't know you already. So Casey Rehm is a multidisciplinary computational designer and principal of Studio Kinch in Los Angeles. He teaches at SCI-Arc, where he is the coordinator for the Master of Science in Architectural Technology postgraduate program. Casey's work focuses on the intersection of artificial intelligence, data, digital media, and design. And we're also joined by Marceline Gao, who is HT advisor and faculty at SCI-Arc. Hi, Marceline. So I'm going to ask Casey to just take it over, and we can get going.
Okay. So thank you for having me today. This is I think the first year that they're doing these in thesis, and I'm not 100% clear, what exactly the expectations are. When we're talking about technology, we're talking about a kind of vast and deeply interconnected with human evolution space. So asked to do a kind of 20 or 30-minute presentation on that space is kind of an interesting provocation. And so obviously we're not looking at producing any kind of comprehensive agenda relative to technology, but I wanted to kind of speak specifically about, say like a particular issue which I think has pretty significant impact on already like contemporary culture and society, but is, we're still kind of unclear about what the impacts are on the discipline of architecture. I think it may be more clear on the impacts to practice rather than the conception or the theorization of design projects or how design projects might evolve, particularly because there's always a kind of link between technology and the context in which it's produced, right? Like at the moment, when we're talking about global technological production, it's largely in capitalist-driven economies, and the investment of labor in the specific territories of production of technology are driven by that reality. So let me share my screen here. So I'm going to also just kind of specifically talk about like one kind of slice of that, and that's predominantly the technologies which are allowing us to essentially automate intellectual labor. And these are, the machines that sit at the center of the platforms which are now kind of thoroughly integrated within our lives for like mediating our lives. I know like Damien has like his own project on platform. The ones that I'm that kind of been interesting to myself, people like Jose Sanchez, Daniel Kohler, and this group tend to be doing more with the platforms which are automating the kind of aggregation and collection of data and how that is being translated into commercial production. So one of the things that's at the root of that, this idea that you can turn raw data into economic or cultural value, is this whole project of translation, of constructing structures of meaning on top of meaningless data. If it doesn't matter if Google is able to accumulate millions and billions of search requests and trying to create a kind of hierarchical order of the internet, if it doesn't have that mechanism or that algorithm or intelligence to translate all those searches into something meaningful or useful. So one of the things that has occurred though is when we look at the types of artificial intelligence that situate themselves at this intersection in the platforms that we use for automation is that they have what was described by Yokui as this kind of basis in the kind of market-driven and the culture that we live in, which has kind of evolved from an Enlightenment project on universalism. This idea that these machines should be designed to accommodate like all possible realities or all possible design ideas within them. And so when you look at the kind of evolution of artificial intelligence projects, that's kind of at the heart of it. There's an urge to produce things which can accommodate the largest possible audience or the largest possible, actually more accurately, like market share for the machines. And frequently that means that it's constraining the possibilities for more specific or idiosyncratic or even marginalized participation in the project. Just as a kind of like interesting aside, I think there have been kind of major technological projects in the last 100 years that were obviously authored underneath other kind of market environments, in particular but still I think they're still operating underneath this kind of centralist and universalist agenda. Like just as an example though of like how the context in which something is produced can create an alternative kind of set of demands on a technological system. I think a good example of that is the OGAS, which is the acronym for the All-State Automated System for Gathering and Processing of Information for the Accounting, Planning, and Governance of the National Economy in the USSR, which was a project that kind of paralleled the ARPANET project here in the US. Both of them were looking at creating network computer systems, but with very different agendas and very different intention behind it. And in some ways, I think it's interesting to look and see how the OGAS's kind of agendas have now become prescient in a way to some of the things that we're grappling with now. As our own internet, the one that we currently use, the Web 2.0, has a more direct evolution from the ARPANET project. Well, so one of the kind of interesting things about this and the agenda behind this platform was that there was some specific characteristics that happened to parallel directly these kind of state agendas, and the intention for the network was a bit different than the one for the ARPANET. So like one of the kind of major things that has had a deep impact on some of the platforms that we're working with now and some of the intelligences we have now is this. There was a need at the time to deal with the fact that there was no pricing model for goods on the USSR's markets of exchange, because those are typically have been set in the Western world through things like supply and demand and the capitalist market setting that kind of price through kind of collective purchasing behavior. So one of the things that had to be built into it was the kind of planned economy, this idea of kind of changing the value of a good off of the kind of capitalist support for it and aligning it more directly with the state significance. So how valuable something was to the forwarding of the state agenda was a replacement through these models. And this is an example of one that was never, this one was ever actually implemented. It always ran into kind of funding and bureaucratic shortcomings. But there was a kind of a need that had to be addressed by this platform for kind of setting the costs of things in a new market space that was unstructured by traditional barter, or traditional exchange. So it led to a lot of kind of interesting innovations that we use now, like including like it proposed parallel computing at a time when like Western computers were completely dependent on the von Neumann model, which is what all you guys are working on right now on your computers. It's just the RAM sends something to the processor, and then they store it on the hard drive, and there's a kind of bottleneck of performance. So one of the things that they wanted to build into this was this kind of collective computing or hyper-threading or distributed computing that like most of you guys actually are starting to use now, and is at the kind of basis of all kind of cloud computing platforms. And then actually was one of the first positionings of e-currency, which has now obviously become the a significant part of any of the commercial platforms that we run now. So, I think it's a kind of interesting shortcut and kind of talking a little, or tangential note, and talking a little bit about the, Yuki's comment in this discussion. And this is from a book, Atlas of Anomalous AI, which was recently released last year. And it's a conversation between himself and, sorry, I just put his name down. That was a mistake. Warning. Himself and two others within the Ramon Amaro, and it was a conversation moderated by Rana Dasgupta. And anyway, this is just one of the topics they talk about, but there's one of the main things that they get at is this kind of lack of diversity. And so I think it's interesting that even something that we would think has emerged from this OGAS system and some of the qualities, how it has become kind of appropriated or homogenized into the that kind of operating basis of something like Amazon or even Google's PageRank algorithm have some kind of roots in that OGAS project. And I think this is what they're talking about, or Yuki is kind of lamenting, is this lack of kind of multiple tangents that remain extant or provide kind of real alternatives to a more what he sees as the kind of homogeneous production of technology. So I gave you guys kind of two examples of networks because I think on a very small scale, they're useful references to this idea. And I say they're on a small scale, but they're actually rather huge endeavors. So the first one I gave you guys was a network that's designed to produce images from text, right? This clip VQGAN, which is a product of OpenAI. Actually, I think both of these are OpenAI-based models. But the VQGAN is trained on something called the Imagenet. So Imagenet was something that was created in 2006 or proposed in 2006 by Fei Li, because a lot of investment had occurred in the development of algorithms for training things like neural networks or machine learning packages. But there hadn't been a serious investment in trying to understand and trying to create some kind of standard in what those things were trained on. So Imagenet is this massive image library of classified images that have become used as a standard for testing things like image classifiers. And the idea behind it is it's a suitably kind of universal collection of things that could be seen by an AI network, right? So you have dogs, you have cats, you have buildings. This is not something that was been trained to kind of for like a single specific task. This is something that has been trained to cover all the bases in terms of creating a standard for AI training and development. And a competition was kind of kicked off every year for using this as a standard set and testing the performance of any machine learning algorithms for image classification in particular that you were working with against the performance of others using this set as a kind of standard. And you start to see things too, like some of the image classifiers like Inception and VGG start outperforming humans at the same task of classification. But even within this, theoretically universal module of millions of images, it's already become a concern of, for example, Google and a couple others. But this is from a Google research proposal that got kind of leaked out to the media about the need to produce to kind of relook at the Imagenet because of concerns that its idiosyncrasies in terms of how it was built are leading to kind of these false performance evaluations of the machine. And it's pretty interesting if you look at how Imagenet was built. There's a great book called Ghostwork that talks about its production. The production of it, because you had to label these millions of images with categories, was actually distributed across Amazon. So you would think that, or the Amazon Mechanical Turk. So we kind of think that by like crowdsourcing these images that you would get kind of some kind of at least relaxing of biases in the data set construction or specific idiosyncrasies. But the Google engineers are arguing that just in the kind of formulation of the classifications and the instructions for how to classify, you're already embedding these kind of blind spots into this theoretically universal module. So yeah, so the top label here are the ones that came out of the original Imagenet classifications, and the real label is using their own labeling system. The other network I gave you guys to play with is GPT-2. And GPT-2 is a language-based network, right? Not an image-based one. And again, the intention of this network was to try to produce a kind of universal language model. And in order to achieve that, a scraping method was utilized where 8 million web pages that were linked through Reddit posts were combined together into this what's called a corpus, which is the training set of sentences and text of that the network is trained on. And they had, in order to kind of improve the quality of that text, they had this minimum criteria that like a post had to have a minimum of 3 upvotes. And a lot of this was driven by a lot of the kind of decisions about how to construct this were driven by the factors that have to do with the mechanisms of GPT-2, which is a transformer, particularly like things like having a lot of repetition, like having nonsensical language in the corpus would like have extremely negative impacts on the body of text, right? But even if looking at it, I think even with 8 million web pages linked through the Reddit posts, I think it's easy to see that there may be some kind of inbuilt shortcomings to this project already, in the sense that, you know, if something is not discussed on Reddit, it doesn't show up in GPT-2's lexicon of linguistic knowledge. The version I sent to you guys, I think was it was the direct public release from OpenAI on GitHub, and it allows you to work with a network that's trained on these 8 million web pages. And it has what are like 1.5 billion parameters. So that's the number of calculations that it can make about in comparison, comparing features within a sentence. So the GPT-2 is pretty good, and it kind of was the first one of these language-based networks, particularly because it was open source, that seemed to kind of give the appearance of actual you know, competent writing. So recently they released GPT-3, OpenAI did, which is a significant increase in the number of parameters and training set for from GPT-2. So GPT-2 had 1.5 billion parameters. GPT-3 utilizes 175 billion parameters, right? That's a significant increase of number of zeros of the scale of the model. And I think it kind of highlights this idea about the way that these things operate is in some ways like very straightforward. It's just about feeding them more and more and making them larger and larger in order to increase performance. So what you see with GPT-3 is the language is definitely much more polished. But in this case, the things that it's trained on, the actual code of the network have been stepped on. So in our little exercise I had for you guys, I wanted you to begin to explore working with both of these, starting to compare them against the text of the individual. When we're looking at, mostly because I wanted you guys to begin to start to push and pull at the idea of, you know, a network which has tried to be trained as universally as possible to respond to inputs in both the kind of Imagenet image generator and the text production of GPT-2, and begin to compare those against the things that were actually stated in the readings. This is an example from of kind of this exercise being put out by Kealato McDowell, who's taught classes here at SCI-Arc in the past, done lectures and workshops. He's the director of Google AMI's Artist Machine Intelligence grant project. But he released a book that think I spelled it. No, I think it's spelled right. Called pharmacoai, which he co-wrote with GPT-3. And I think that it's an interesting attempt to not try to kind of play into GPT-3's like competence, I guess, for lack of a better word, but to begin to find a way of creating a dialogue with this thing which has tendencies to produce nonsensical language as a way of escaping or finding new types of idiosyncrasies within the model, right? So I think if we're looking at like this kind of strategy in comparison to, you know, this kind of provocation of, you know, how valuable the universal model is, or what kind of projects there are for designing against this, I think this is an interesting one because this is attempting to continue to reinsert a human provocateur into the automated task of writing this book in order to kind of disrupt the tendencies of the model. But also I think that what happens is if you read the book or parts of the book, maybe you start to see that Kenrick also begins to, I think, purposely lean into some of the idiosyncrasies of the project. So when we're talking about how this applies to architecture and this issue of thinking about the technological platforms as from this universalist point of view, you start to look at, you know, how the market drives software development and practice production, right? So with Revit, you have 4 million current users of the software. And if we think about the kind of vast quantities of information that we were just talking about that are needed to begin to train those models, there's obviously going to be a cost to building up something that has universal intention. And I think Revit is a software that Autodesk views as having a kind of universal application to architecture, right? But that obviously means that it's going to be targeting based on the kind of bulk of the market, the way architecture is produced currently, right? And the way that the vast majority of architects produce work. And the development of any of these systems, from the the image classifier to the GPT-2, they represent huge investments of carbon, time, and money. And so beginning to kind of minimize or purposefully eschew the kind of idiosyncratic or outlying or marginalized ambitions within a field of architecture, like in the case of Revit, you're going to end up with a much more constrained view of what architecture could be. To the point that when I was at RPI, we were entering into kind of a research agreement with Autodesk, or discussing it, and the regular refrain we heard from the Autodesk people were, why do you guys want to keep using Maya? Like, if you do your modeling with the mass modeler in Revit, you'll start off the bat with architectural geometry, right? Which means that what we're doing is we're giving over the bounding of what the design space is and the domain of what architectural design can be to essentially the marketing group at Autodesk, right? Which has a very different ambition, which I think starts to bring us to like why we want to go through this exercise, why I think myself and someone like Damian definitely feels that it's imperative that architects be capable enough to, at least to some extent, design their own software, right? That you're able to escape the confounds and like understand that any of these software has built-in domains, right? Like the limits of these things are pre-designed into the package. That if you are unable to kind of navigate away from what the tools are that are given to you, then you're kind of constrained to always repeat what the kind of the central majority of practitioners that the software is designed for. And there's definitely advantages to that, right? Like there's efficiencies in construction and operating an office. So I don't think it's also worthwhile to abandon the software, but what we're kind of advocating for is just understanding what the intentions were in its production, how those are kind of directly limiting and constraining your design project. This is just another example of a project that's being actually built in-house by Gensler. And this is an attempt to make a tool to do kind of universal feasibility studies within their own office. And I think it's interesting when you look at what offices are actually being able to invest in this type of software development. Again, if you're looking at the problem of kind of training and building up this intelligence, it's only going to be offices which already have huge corpuses of work at their disposal, right? That's because we don't have a publicly available ImageNet of architectural building plans or feasibility studies. Which I think I didn't know how long I would take. I think I've been talking too much. I said 20 minutes. So I'll just end on this kind of quote from Patricia Reed, which is from her essay, Making Ready for a Big World. And it's highlighting the need for kind of alternative thinking to escape the inductive stagnation that comes from, that is, as you know, as a potential limit of any of these models that we're talking about, or any of these pieces of software. And that this idea of inductive stagnation, she defines as this idea that it's any time that you think that the all possible solutions to a problem have to be already extant or already existing, right? And so any of these kind of intelligence models that we've been describing are all relying on the fact that there may be some collection of features embedded in what has already come before, that within that domain space, the problem can solve them, right? Okay, so I have a bunch of like glitch videos and stuff, but you guys have probably seen those on interwebs. Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that one of the kind of tenets of the architectural technology program is that we kind of go immediately into kind of base level things like neural networks. And so the students can begin to kind of leverage and explore them. So like, for example, as a kickoff exercise this semester, the students went out and started trying different forms of scanning in the city to try to three-dimensionally represent different blocks within LA. And then they came back through and started to look at how the different forms of three-dimensional documentation of the city produced different results with things like image classifiers. This image classifier was trained on Imagenet, actually. So in this case, Kai has done a kind of composited scan of the facade. I think it's a building next to the Grand Central Market. And he's done it with photogrammetry, LiDAR, and a neural network, which translates to from 2D images to 3D images, actually put out by Facebook, called monodepth, because he's interested. He wanted to start to see like what the kind of impacts of these different models, like this one is for sure monodepth, are on the kind of mechanisms with which we see environment. So starting to test the limits or test the eccentricities that are embedded with these different tools, which have this kind of universal agenda built into them. As kind of one aspect of this, like starting to understand the blind spots or the peculiarities of these machines as a way of beginning to set up a strategy for developing his own software. Yeah, okay. Is that good?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. So I think what is next is basically the students will show their responses, or what is the plan actually? This is something I want to ask you.
Asking me?
Yeah.
I think I got the same email you did. They said talk for 20 minutes and then the students, then there'll be a discussion with the students with the provocation.
Perfect. I think
Can
that's
you give me 1 minute?
Yeah.
Or 30 seconds? Okay, sorry,
Absolutely.
Just a second.
Absolutely. So I guess what we'll do now is we'll just get into everyone's project and have a conversation across the board. So yeah. If you have any questions for the presentation, the case you just gave, you can also ask that before we get into the individual projects. And maybe that's a good way to kick off the conversation, really. Yeah.
Casey, thank you. That was amazing. I was wondering, just by way of like maybe opening the discussion, I think that this idea of the inductive stagnation that you were mentioning towards the end is really provocative in the context of thesis, because when we define thesis, we often say that it's about making an original contribution to the field. And so I was wondering if you could reflect on like maybe how some of these issues might impact, just thinking about the sort of collective intelligence assembled around us here in this workshop and this class of thesis students. Because it also occurred to me that when you mentioned idiosyncrasies and the idea of sort of obsolescence, that if something isn't kind of reinforced and written about, it sort of falls out of, it becomes almost like an obsolete term. And I was just thinking about that in terms of all the different topics that people might be working on for thesis. Yeah, just fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, so I posted a link to one of the articles. I'm not actually sure if conductive stagnation is Patricia's word or not. Like, she's the only person I've heard use it, but I like it a lot. So we've been, it's become like our the thing that we're most afraid of, and well, climate change, and then conductive stagnation within the Architect program, I'd say. So it's this idea, right, that like all the neural nets, you guys all just played around with like pre-trained ones. Some of you guys have used them before, have trained them yourself, right? Like you have to build up this vast quantity of information, which gets fragmented down into features and recombined. Or the transformer like GPT22, which is not a neural net, but it's another machine learning model. Right, so it's this idea that these models can only produce things which they've seen before to an extent. Now, it's an interesting gray area, because when we're talking about kind of fragmenting those images into features, you start to, the idea is that you start to accumulate so many features that combinatorially you can effectively represent all possible solutions in the space, right? But like one of the things that you can't do then in that case though is change the domain space, right? Like if you're training a neural network, for example, for images on like 1024 by 1024 pixel images, it's not going to all of a sudden be able to play chess, right? Or it means that any solution you're looking for has to exist within that 1024 by 1024 space. So there's the issue of the kind of domain problem, and there's the issue of the feature problem. So when we look at like works that are kind of using universal models, like, I mean, actually within our own office at Kinch, and then within most of the studios I teach, we kind of very rarely use models that were designed like that for our use, because we're kind of specifically making like weird houses and stuff and trying to automate our own design agenda. But things like the Beast, right? That would be an example of one project where we were using these types of models. Sorry, I had an idea. I started, and then I forgot what I was saying.
Maybe I can also ask you some questions about this. I thought it would be interesting to think about the problem of authorship, and I know that you love talking about this problem.
Oh, I hate it. Exactly. No, but okay. So I just remember now why I brought that up. So like if you look at kind of the projects that are existing in architectural space, and we'll be pretty generous here, around these types of tools, the ones that are kind of engaging the universal models, at least initially, like in any of the projects which we're working with style transfer as an example, right? And what I think is interesting as we start to have a little bit of time now to have a little anthropology on our recent past, revisionist history, whatever, when you start to look at like what are the tropes that are utilized to kind of, I guess, actually this is a good segue also gaining authorship within that space. You're looking at the kind of resurgence of the surrealist project, right? And the projects on the hybrids, like taking two unlike things and relying on the fact that this huge combinatorial space can seamlessly merge these things in a way that is not collage or not assembled in a way that's visually understood by the kind of human observer. Like that has become one project that became extremely dominant, I would say, in like the architecture schools, like including here at SCI-Arc. Like there's obviously been a lot of style transfer work with things like most of David and Carol's work for a while was operating in that space, and it produced some very seductive images, right? But I think now they're looking at kind of alternative projects. Where I think if you're looking at like the kind of space that like my office sits in, and the projects around automation, and this has to do a lot too with me having to teach with Ben Bratton for a couple of years for his seminar. and essential preoccupations on models of perception and how they change the world that we live in. It's all about trying to understand the specific ways that the models see a problem and beginning to leverage that. So I think like in the background is like my it's a neural net reorganized set of architectural features from the Campo Marzio that we did like back in 2016. And this data set is something that we misuse and reutilize in our in pretty much almost all of our architectural projects. Like it's because it has so many different features, but it also has very specific characteristics, like this overprevalence of thresholds. So models like that, like so this is actually an image classifier that's sorting these things out, are interesting to us because they allow us to see problems from our past differently. Right, like it allows us to look at the architectural canon through a lens of feature comparison and flesh at distance without any concern for what Defurry said about the cult of the fragment or any of these other kind of readings now that we're embedded with as a discipline. So this kind of I think like another project is maybe specifically working with models that may have been designed for universal application initially, but then more narrowly like applying them or retraining them towards the specific tasks as just kind of relying on how that structural network that was set up, the actual kind of morphology of the AI carries its own kind of alternative ways of understanding problems. So I guess that's misusing the model, right? Kind of these two maybe extant networks of engaging with these things, which. Yeah, I mean, there's also the fear of homogenization that occurs with this stuff, and I think Patricia's also not just talking about neural networks, but social media-based platforms or platforms of collective valuation. When in her essay on inductive stagnation, and there's times where you become very concerned about the homogenizing effects of Instagram, for example, on aesthetics, like something about the structure of what types of images get likes versus which ones don't, tend to drive content in very homogeneous directions under the guise of individual expression. Like we have a lot of individuals whose stuff looks like everybody else's stuff right now on Instagram. But when you take deep dives, there's also the problem of having to like relook at that problem or relook at that space in a way that we haven't before. And this is something like Lev Manovich has always done a pretty interesting job at, like using different tools to explore that space. And when you actually look at it, he's identified a whole taxonomy of emergent compositional aesthetics and compositional agendas that have nothing to do with what we learned at school. Like he calls them the design category of posts, which are just posts which emerged from how people exist on Instagram versus how you and I would take a photo based on our classes with people like that are awesome at composition, like Francia. Yeah.
Maybe a related question, and maybe that's not something we talked about before in some cases, I think, is that there was a whole history of this idea of process as tied to kind of the idea of design authorship, right? Like especially in the 90s, there was kind of a dominance of digital processes and this idea that you can kind of understand the process and be, you're the author of the process. And I think there is a historical dimension of that, which has to do with this idea of projection, right? As design as projection, design as kind of putting forward something into the world through a graphical medium, right? Either a mathematical kind of construct or a diagram. And it seems to me, I think that some of that history might be a little bit maybe put aside when we talk about AI, and because we do always talk about a database of finished images, of images where you have no access into like how the image was made in some ways, right? You have only access to the finished kind of artifact. And by that time, I mean, some of the modernist artists would say, or Picasso would say, by the time that it's done, I'm not interested in it anymore, in a way. So is there like something where you're thinking about this idea of AI as being used as means of intercepting the process of design rather than kind of as being used as this kind of exercises in surrealism, as you say.
I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, there's always a gradient with any of these projects of like an awareness of what the tools are actually doing, or what these processes are. There's, you know, I don't think it's a new problem that's based on AI. I think it's just like there are artworks which are driven by an understanding the processes which produce them, right? And then there's ones which are, you know, have other agendas. Yeah, you know, like the surrealist project, like, or the kind of style, let's call it the style transfer project. That's not really fair. I mean, it's also kind of broad stroking a whole bunch of stuff, some of it pretty bad, some of it good. So, but let's just call it that one. Like, I guess that would be an example of in general, of people who are operating with naivete towards the machine, right? But you know, the kind of trajectory, the stuff that we do certainly isn't like doing that. Like, we know how the machines work, and we intercede, you know, many levels into the process. Like, you know, one of the things that I guess it's relating to this though is, you know, like we don't design any neural network like completely from scratch. Like, we do a lot of hacking and modifying to get like the 3D networks out of pix to pix and stuff. But I don't think that's a new thing either, you know. Like, it's always been SAT, right? Which is a great Oasis album. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't necessarily think it's a novel project or novel issue with these.
It's not. Okay.
I don't know. That's my take on it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, what you call it? What's the dude who built the pyramids? Like he was the only one that understood the trick, you know. But a lot of people worked on those projects. So I think there's always different layers of expertise in production of cultural artifacts.
Right. No, I mean, the only reason I'm asking this is because the whole notion of an author was like heavily influenced by, not even in architecture, but in general, right? In culture, was influenced, for example, by the French New Wave film directors. They kind of like established this idea that you can be an author within a kind of industrial process, right? So, which is kind of, I think, related to what you're talking about in some ways, at least to my understanding. But yeah, this idea that there is like an industrial process, extremely complicated, of making a film, and then an author is someone who kind of steps in with an idea and is able to understand the layers and technical complexity, but more than that, it's able to kind of infuse their own, you know, idea and kind of guide the process really to kind of the final result, which I think is related to this problem with thesis, because you could say it's at some level that any kind of software manipulation is kind of, you know, a black box to some extent, right? I mean, there is always a level of where you can say, oh, I don't really know what's happening in like the Rehm or loft command or something.
Yeah,
it's interesting that I think maybe students can also think about this as well.
Well, I'm curious, like, what you guys made. Like, you guys were supposed to make stuff for today. Oh, so like the provocation came out too because I had to teach a history theory class for the first time this semester, like a proper one that isn't like making houses, which was the kind of the sneaky one that Mimi and I were doing, where it was like Marika was very strict this semester, like no making stuff. Like, okay, just reading. So what we're doing instead is we're going to have the students co-write their final papers with PT 2 and 3 and have the AI generate all the final graphics and figures and diagrams for it. So I figured that would be kind of a fun game to play with the thesis prep. Start to experiment around with it a little bit. So what'd you guys make? Do we have a mural board of stuff you guys made? Austin, you're nodding. Let's see the stuff. I'm curious what you've had.
We were having a InDesign template to make the journal.
Yeah, so
okay,
maybe
cool.
Exactly. So maybe we can just have a list of people who are presenting, and please put your names in the chat right now so we can just go through everyone's presentation. And Austin is the first one.
still have mine
Yeah.
on the Google Doc, so.
And there are questions, like you're supposed to answer questions, I guess.
Oh yeah, I have the questions too, but
Okay, cool.
I guess like of the stuff I made, I base it off of the precision of promiscuity by Perry Culper. It's like a text I'm using, I guess probably the main ideas behind my thesis so far. And this is like the paragraph. This is like his kind of opening statement in the essay of what he's going to talk about. And then he gets more into, I guess his problem's more like the language of design, how we describe a project before we design it, and you kind of inherently design based off of cues of how that project like should look. So he's kind of arguing that we don't really design as much anymore because we're too like wrapped up on expectations. And like this was an example, I think it was like a convention center of like something he designed, like trying to design without thinking of any cues whatsoever, like what this program should look like. So after I fed the text in, this was the result. It's quite convincing. I was kind of surprised. It feeds along somewhat with what Perry Culper was talking about, I guess, in the first two paragraphs. And then the AI kind of shifted more to like linguistics associated with like more of a built product and not so much about kind of like the change of linguistics in the design process, which was pretty interesting because it's two valid points, but it's kind of almost contradicting itself. And then,
well, it went on for a while.
yeah, like it spit a lot of results out. Then the image that it generated was this image, which was pretty interesting actually, because
how long did you run it?
I ran it through 6 times, I think, through 6 passes. And then after like the fourth, 5th, and 6th all looked very similar. So I think this was the 6th one. Yeah, it was
yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's kind of two things. I forgot because I ran out of time, but I was going to talk a little bit about the beast, right? And which used GPT-2, but we retrained it on a corpus of like SCI-Arc faculty and SCI-Arc adjacent faculty. You know, like Jeff Kipnis has been on thesis, so we included his text, and like Brett Steele lectured here once, so we included his text. But it's like mirrors and stuff, and it was specifically because like we noticed that same trend, right? Like it would pick up the words within the first paragraph that seemed to more directly relate, but then it would start to spiral away into like more general conversation, I think. Also, we noticed too, like I don't know if you see this, but we found that it tends to kind of leave the jargon of architecture for the jargon of the art world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which we think is interesting. I mean, and if you think about what that just means is kind of a cultural, like again, using these machines as a lens to look at problems differently, like that starts to become something like almost a representational tool of the relative scale of impact of kind of architecture within the discourse on Reddit, I guess is what we're looking at, right?
Yeah.
Also the images too, you know, so this is like an interesting conversation I've had with David for a while, because like he's I think like he wanted to when he was first getting into style transfer, like he asked if I could like retrain like something like Inception or VGG19, which are the image classifiers style transfer runs off on like SCI-Arc's oeuvre, rather than on the you know, the Imagenet data set. And on the one hand, you know, yeah, we can definitely do that. But I actually at the time, and I'm kind of think it would be fun, maybe it'd be interesting to just do a kind of quick lean at this. Just maybe make a StyleGAN pre-trained on SCI-Arc work that we could put out in the world for branded content. But actually, like these types of images are like very peculiar, right, compared to the things that we draw here. And like, so I like this idea of having these kind of super universal features that can be recombined, because it opens up the design space, I think, more from, you know, what we would expect a SCI-Arc project to look like, for example, or this certainly doesn't look like Perry Culper's project. But I've definitely noticed, like with VQGAN, like I typed in like brutalist city one point and it made something that looked a lot like this. So I think that there's like a a gap between that promise of infinite, infinitely vast combinatorial features and what that thing actually does. And maybe more interesting to start to train one of these guys on, just like your own work. I mean, a good example of that is if you've seen Koop Himmelblau has like worked with Daniel Bolligen to essentially train. I don't know if it's like it could be one of any number of image models, but it looks like it's a model that translates kind of maybe flat shaded things into stuff that looks like Koop Himmelblau's work, right? It kind of works. Like it's like this kind of version of Himmelblau's work, but that becomes very directly this project of automating rendering, right? And automating like facade design. Whereas this one kind of feels at least like initially like some kind of exploration of a space that you don't know yet. Anyway, I think it's interesting to see this because it looks exactly like the stuff that I got when I did tests at home, which means we're going to have to retrain the network for the seminar. So did you find anything in particular that was interesting to you about the relationship between like this figure and the other figure, or like this text and the other text, or in the original text?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things I found like the most interesting, I guess, was how I guess like Perry Culper was kind of arguing against like the idea of, I guess, like associating like programmatic language with design. And then like the whole second half of this essay was talking about developing a design language like around design, and like it was just kind of almost contradicting to what Perry Culper said. So I think that was interesting how like it used the exact same words, but in a very contradictory way. But even like the image produced, like when you start to look at it in comparison with some of Perry Culper's work, like there, especially like when you got into more rendering and less hand drawing, there is somewhat of like a similarity between like these kind of disjointed images and figures, like as compared to this. I mean, this is a little more unified, like with the color scheme wise, but there still is these kind of disjointed figures and like patterns and textures like present, which was pretty interesting to see.
Did you try loading one of those images in to start the process?
No, I just use only the words.
Okay. That might be an interesting way of collaborating with too. It would be interesting to see how far you could get away from something like this.
Yeah.
By like putting one of Perry's works in as the initial point. And then it begins, like then you're starting to use it, right, as a tool for automating work. Like you put in a little bit, it gives you back theoretically more, which is the kind of why all these things are designed, but they don't always work that well.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So that means that the collective discourse on Reddit. So like you guys, like GPT-2 is like, it's called a transformer. And essentially all it's doing is like looking at each word as like improbability to all the ones around it. So it's a kind of total probability map. So that there's like something that's interesting there about the GPT-2 starting to kind of almost refute Perry. It's like again, the kind of collective knowledge of Reddit says, no, like Perry is wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously he isn't, but there is no wrong here. But I think that's a kind of fun discovery a little bit, like what the discourse is that's out there. That was the other idea of the beast, is and stuff that we found too, right? It was like it started out with SCI-Arc faculty mostly, and the artists that were in the show, and then every night it went and got stuff from Flickr, and based on like a hashtag tree that it evolved its own like hashtag tree over time. But started out with just like architecture, I think brutalism too. Just it's hard to get enough images, but like apparently like if Flickr thinks architecture is mostly like Scottish castles, right? So there's like that's like where the collective value of architecture is on social media, which is a maybe is useful information for beginning to think about our role as a cultural agency within large populations, right? Rather than like if you want to get into a project on designing for collective or designing for universal, the kind of modernist project, that seems like interesting information to know.
Certainly.
Which is not the model that most of the cool stuff comes out of, right? Designing for very single, high capital focused entities. Cool. We want to go do another one? Do you guys have any thoughts, Marceline?
Yeah, I thought from Austin, from yours, the way in which design language then returned back to the word, I thought that was fascinating because, of course, when we use that expression, developing a design language, we're not thinking literally of written words usually.
Right.
And so that kind of misunderstanding, swerving, language back to word, I think is also just worth pointing out and could be something to work with, I guess, in terms of like, and I'm also thinking about this question of like arguing back with Perry. When you were saying that, Casey, I was thinking, I wonder if you could get it to have a debate. Like, can you argue with the AI? Like in that process of collaboration, in terms, like people often talk about it like, oh, finishing my sentences or completing my thoughts, but then can you have a kind of confrontation staged?
Yeah, and again, like if you think about where its corpus came from, it'll get into some pretty not safe for work debate as well. Like it's not a Yale Debate Club practitioner. I sent it over to my mom. It's a very nice woman in her 70s, and it was just telling her to fuck off and stuff, and it got pretty intense.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, but you can 100% debate it. I mean, Ross Lovegood. That's not his name.
Lovegrove? Ross Lovegrove?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He came and lectured a couple years ago, right? Like he did a whole series of both like poems and conversations or arguments with it. I mean, I think there's something to Kenrick's or Kaylato McDowell's book about that too, where at some points it feels like completing the sentence, but it also feels that there's moments where they're kind of operating in debate with each other. So it could be like a useful tool to, I guess, like as a to automate the use of, we operate in the college frequently to destabilize our own agendas by having debate or conversation with our colleagues. Maybe this can just automate that part so we don't have to come into school anymore.
You could have your own review, like your crit.
Yeah.
All your adversarial critics giving their opinions on your thesis.
That sounds really, really interesting, actually. I think we can totally. But, one thing also, when I think about this, I always think about the problem of translation. Like, where does it happen? How do I know that it's doing something that is interesting, at least, because it seems that the history of the discipline and this idea of design is really tied to graphical procedures, right? That the intelligence is embedded in the way that we are operating graphically. And, so it's a question to which extent now we can just like step out of it and say, okay, I'm just going to give instructions, like verbal instructions. Because, I mean, ironically enough, there is in Mario Carpo's book, he's this, I think the first book on the digital turn, he's describing like pre-perspectival ways of design as being verbal, right? So basically a set of instructions that kind of a master builder would give to someone in the field, literally building a cathedral or a house or something, yeah? And it's a verbal set of instructions. There was no drawing. There was no this like idea of like representation. So it's interesting, kind of like many centuries later, we're kind of going back into that free form thing, which is pretty cool. If it's true, let's see. Okay, I think Gary wanted to go next.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yes. Let me share my screen. So for the provocation workshop, this is what I did. So let me introduce the background. So my thesis, so far I called it the topic, the PSP public spawn point. So I will skip this one. So I was looking into a context of the metaverse. So because the metaverse is recently a very hot topic, but it was first mentioned in 1993 by Neil Stephenson in his novels Snow Crash. This is the novel. So so in one of his novel chapter, there's a very interesting idea that people are coming into the metaverse, which is the virtual world, not like appear suddenly in nowhere, but they actually is coming from their house or a public terminal. So I'm looking into a architecture possibility in the public span point. So there are a few instances showing like how this is the span point in the game, and this is the flow network that are used in Harry Potter. And this is a very impressive image of spawning. So looking to the provocation, I was making because the Snow Crash is the node, so I use their words directly describing the spawn points. So this is the topic that can generate the image. And this is a few language they are used. So I copy and paste it into the what's that? The clip, the generator, the game clip generator. So this is how it looks like. So this one very looks like a certain like map, but suddenly someone appear in the middle and you can see the red flags, or you can see as the demon. This one looks like a human standing in nowhere. And these are another two images. I realize the generator tend to pick up words, pick up some words they are interested in. For example, this one, I'm not sure whether it's because it has capitalized the first letter. So it looks like it generates a few houses in the picture. But also I can know that so the generator cannot catch the main idea of the topic. It can only like pick a few words and generate what you think about. And this one also, he picked up the street, and you can see this is a guy. There are cars. This is the street color, and there's a line of people. And I also try to generate a few words. I picked three parts of the novel. So interesting part I found was the first paragraph and the second paragraph are mostly most like a descriptive word paragraph. But the third one is very much a narrative. So it's talking about a story. But the first and second are talking about a necessary knowledge about the snow crash. So that the first and second paragraph are very much like a thesis, and very much like an essay. But the third one, you can see lots of quotations. So it is actually very much like a novel, AI generating. That's what I found interesting in using, trying to use the AI generator for text and images.
So the provocations that you, or the seeds that you gave him, they were from novels as well?
From the novel, from the Snow Crash.
From Snow Crash, yeah.
Yeah.
That's something that it definitely does. Like when you work with it, like you can, like it can switch, like even GPT-2 can like switch kind of formats or genres depending on what you feed it. Like you can give it stage direction, it'll spit back stage direction. There's actually some pretty good examples too. With GPT-3, it worked actually pretty well, where you can have it write software in code. You can also have it write kind of music in notation, right? Like tablature. Like I saw a guy make some guitar tablature with it. That was kind of interesting. So there's this ability to kind of ape the whatever kind of genre that you're operating in, like kind of the stylistic tropes and the the forms of what you feed it impact the things that it produces, which might be something to, I don't know. You're probably not going to play with it anymore, but that is something that it is able to do or respond to, which makes sense if you think about it, just kind of understanding the form of the language, not necessarily not having any understanding of the content of what it's saying, right? Is this any good? This new novel that it's written?
I tried to read it. It looks a little bit nonsense.
Yeah.
But it's still but it's still very interesting. So I guess I can extract some from the AI generated text, but I will try more.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what you end up doing if you end up doing anything with this, but it is kind of interesting to see like how you can begin to steer it through what you feed it. The original version, there was some early intentions of there's a available corpus that you can get for training that is, it's like this a big stack of unpublished novels, like novels that got rejected by publishing houses, and they just kind of sit out in the ether. And they actually rejected it because it wasn't universal stylistically. It was one of the reasons, because it was all kind of fiction prose. How you guys? So you guys kind of left the settings the same. It looks like in terms of the time it runs, they're all a little bit undercooked. That's okay.
I'm still trying more settings for that one.
Yeah, it's funny that when you put spawn, it just started to draw the cartoon or the comic book character, I think.
Right. This one is really funny. It's really unexpected.
They're all fairly perspectival, I think. One of the things that, you know, even though it's trained on Imagenet, and which I guess makes sense, like Imagenet is kind of all photographs of stuff, right? Because it was initially created as a way of evaluating image classifiers for, like, you know, object detection and things like that. Not object detection, but because that came a little bit later. But it is going to be predominantly going to make things that are perspectival like this, or kind of quasi-perspectival like the streetscape and the houses. There's a couple of different versions. It might be interesting to look at playing with some of the different releases of it and some of the different pre-trained networks. Like there's one that's trained on all the artworks on Wikipedia, which is called the WikiArt dataset, which if your kind of aim is to make kind of more graphic elements, like that may be something. I'd be curious to see like if it's more or less interesting in a relationship to like something like Perry Culper's in the last project work, right? Because it has many things in there which are not just perspectival photographs of objects in space, but are kind of more compositional. And then, you know, obviously kind of coming back, if you were to begin to leverage this in your own work, like retraining the network on things which are more suitable to the types of images or figures you want to produce.
So it is possible that so it's the reasonable workload that I can train the AI generator with my images. Can I?
Yeah, that's like my whole office, basically. That's like all we do. And 3D stuff. Yeah, like David one time when he was getting into this asked me if I had any work with 3D networks, and I was like, yeah, and I showed it. And he goes, yeah, but this looks like your old stuff. And I was like, yeah, I trained it on my stuff, like it's automation, baby. Yeah, 100%. You can train it on your own stuff.
Sounds good.
That's literally what Will Crix just did with Himmelblau. And that's for image. But I think, you know, this goes to again, this inductive stagnation problem, right? Like and the question of like, are these tools actually generative in your design process? So if it's exclusively giving you kind of fine-tuned recombinations of your own work, like what other kind of antecedents do you have to make into the project to begin to steer it out of just regurgitating all the work that you've done before? Right.
Yep.
So I think finding some balance between like introducing like your own content and these kind of more generalist things where you're just hoping that it'll make something useful out of it is worthwhile. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
That could also speak to the notion of precedent. Like at what point how conventionally we used to operate with precedent. I think this is something that we talked about also at that Bestia conversation that we filmed last summer. But the idea of precedent literally infusing your work by it being trained on your own work, the possibilities that emerge out of that, but then also sort of desired outcomes from projects that you like and you, for various reasons, are sort of would like to be influenced by. So I think it also kind of makes us think a little bit about what that might mean to be influenced or to learn from a precedent. It's a very different way of like literally becoming infused, like almost absorbing that precedent.
Yeah, it was a forced collaboration in some ways, right? Like in a way that you never would normally, like grabbing some of the features from Damian's work and joining it with your work, in a novel way. So that's I think that's very much like, even if you're not getting into the network structure, like this designing of what the machine is trained on is a huge point of authorship and agency, and like where you can start to interject also potential for generative combinations of features, right?
Maybe a little technical question. So usually how many pictures that I need to feed into the generator in order to let them generate a useful result?
Well, it depends on the machine, and you'll be happy to know that it's getting better. There was a time a couple years ago where I say 20,000, but like it depends on the type of model you're working with too, right? Like when we're working with the more the networks for automation, like we can get really lazy with it in Studio, because like, for example, and we'll have like 500 image networks in training sets, but that's for automating a very specific task, like on models where you're taking like an input and directly translating it into something. I'd say for StyleGAN, for example, you can get good results out of like 2,000 images if you use some of the augmented. There's been a lot of research about how to augment a data set to trick the neural net into thinking it's learning more things than it is, by like subtly shifting features around within an image. Some of them are dumb, like mirroring the image, but rotating it depending on what you're training it on. But other ones are much more subtle, having to deal with like manipulating chunks of images in different locations to kind of trick the machine a bit. So yeah, I would say for just pure image generation, like VGAN, I would try to get up to 2K if possible.
Okay.
Which is easy for someone like Damian or myself, who often represents themselves in image or in real-time rendering. Like Damian can generate 10,000 images, like no problem. And so he was what we would call a bully data set in the Beast when we first started working on it, because it just made a lot of Damian work and a lot of Liam work. The same thing with Liam's films, right? Anyway, yeah, about 2,000.
Okay.
But you can try less, 500. Depends on like the more variants that you have in your set, the more you have to have to allow it to have the features to kind of connect all those things together in space.
Okay.
Great. Let's move on to the next student, who is Dear. So maybe Dear, you can show your work and have a conversation. And please, everyone else who wants to show, just put your name in the chat so we know. And we'll have to actually start timing these conversations so that we can see as many students as possible.
There's just 3.
Just 3, and that's fine. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I was reading a research article on multi-material additive manufacturing and also automation in 3D printing. And I took one of the excerpts which talks about the potentials for multi-material manufacturing, and then I just the bolded part I inserted into the AI generation. One thing I noticed is I made 2 variations, but I'll get back to both of them. So in the first one, it talks about the basics of 3D printing instead of multi-material, and it just continues with a few redundant speeches on the basics of that. And then it dumps down to how 3D printing functions. And then we go to the second one, where I just added a grammatical comma. And then the whole speech development changes, and it's in more inline to multi-material 3D printing. Although I won't claim it to be exact to it, but it creates the same pattern of redundant speeches and multiple conversations, but it still goes pretty much in line to the topic of multi-material 3D printing. And I processed. Another thing I noticed is there's this thing where in the middle of the paragraph it says as discussed in more detail below, but in the previous one it says for each of the basic principles described above. So there's a semblance of pattern development between both the sides of the speeches. Like there's a particular structure it tries to follow. Maybe there might be similar structures in the first half and second half between both of them also. And in terms of the image generation, so I have two images here, which is the first. This is the first cycle of the image and the second cycle of the image. From the same bolded wordings. So it creates this cell-like image, and compared to the first one and the second one, the first one is more like a rigid gridded cell, and the second one it becomes more rounded and smooth. Yeah, that's all.
Would you, I mean, so this is, you have like Liam had a term for this in the past for some of my students that were kind of just working through, like he called them tactical theses, which is kind of seems like at the moment, right? Like trying to think through a kind of specific material process. The text actually in the first paragraph seems like it's a little bit more verbose, but it's actually aping the same kind of like agenda that you're kind of putting forward, right? Like controlling the behavior of the material, understanding the physical properties of it, which is interesting. Which I don't know if that means that this could be this. Also, feel free to ignore anything I say today. I don't want to introduce any like undue paranoia and anxiety into your thesis thinking, but this could mean that you're operating in pretty well-worn territory, right? Like there's a prevalence of content within the public discourse on the internet that is extremely closely aligned to the kind of statements that you're making here, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, this may be a tool that begin, like, is there a way to get this to be kind of antagonistic to your work process, if we were to look at it that way? Or you just use it to automate. And, it might be interesting, like, one of the projects that I less recently because of just the nature of like COVID and stuff, but like a lot of the work we've done with the robot house, for example, in my seminars with some of the software that Jake Newsom made when he was here in Creme, has been about basically making the robots accessible to people that aren't roboticists, right?
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of like real-time drawing apps with the Surface, or like a VR sculpting app and stuff in Unity. So this is like a potential application for this that you could begin to look at within a process like this of 3D printing, right? Like a kind of tool for allowing a mass engagement with this material process through language, right? Like it wouldn't be too hard for us to kind of reconfigure this a bit to make it move from, making kind of funny, blurry images here to actually making something from text, right? That's something kind of Dami and I explored a bit with some projects we worked on together, like just in a different way, but in a related way to like the Twitch Plays architecture thing we did for the grad show, or the Glass Bead game. But right, like it's about like introducing or giving like agency within a design process to kind of unskilled labor, right? Or unskilled designers, which becomes actually a really fascinating project. It's like something that people like Jose Sanchez have been playing with for a while, where he's actually putting out games to work on a kind of collective project of building a design community or expanding the design community. But this idea of like, creating an app where you can just type in some text and it generates a 3D printed object that you could have it shipped to your house or something. It might be an interesting direction for this. Like also, like, because you're talking about 4D printing, which is a space that Nervous System was involved with for a while. I think you're probably still doing it. Do you know them?
No.
Okay, so they like did a bunch of 3D printed like fashion and stuff, household goods, jewelry, and their work is all kind of fairly biomimetic and looks like of a certain period potentially. But one of the things that they've always done have had pretty awesome online web apps. So they have like an app that allows you their 4D printing in their case is they print these things that then can be like that are hinged and stuff so that they can be expanded, so they can like print a dress like in like this much space in the printer, right? But they have this like great apps with like built-in kinematics and things, so you can see how these like you can kind of start to design stuff and mess with it, and then you can send it to the 3D printer from their site. And if you switch to language from material, then it becomes this interesting dialogue too between like you as a designer of this system, and again, like we're talking about where you're introducing your agency as the architect here, like how do you constrain the system and design enough intelligence into the system that no matter what banal trash gets fed into it, something interesting comes out, right? That's kind of fundamental problem of any real-time design application. You have to make things which can consume banality and translate it into something of value. So this is like this would be like a very literal and direct application of this exercise to your project, potentially, rather than just a pure provocation of, does the machine say anything interesting or not?
Yeah.
I think it would also be fascinating to see how closely your description of this image, like if you get it to produce several of these and you imagine that now they're part of your work and you have to explain them, like you're on a review and you're explaining what this is, why it's relevant, and kind of arguing for it. And, you know, from a sort of human intentionality that would differ obviously from the machine and the way in which it was produced. Because I think that idea of words generating image and then image generating word again, like how would you write a project description for this, and how closely might it align with the original, with the source text that you input? You might find, as Casey's saying, maybe because there is a prevalence of this language already out there in the internet, that maybe your description of it would align quite closely. And so you could almost like seamlessly integrate it into a workflow.
Yeah, I agree. And the one thing one thing that's interesting initially was, just this minor invention of the comma, it, changes the whole ball game of the speech and, the accuracy of the speech. So maybe even a few words can, drastically change how the direction of the presentation could go. That creates a lot of potential. I was just surprised, just adding the little comma would make a big difference. I wasn't expecting that personally. I thought only the words would make a difference, but grammatical punctuation also plays with the accuracy of the words. That's surprising by a big margin also. That too. Like the initial talks about the basics of 2D and 3D printing, but the other one actually goes into in line with the topic of multi-material. So that's a big difference in accuracy. That's all. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so since there are no more students in chat, I'm just going to call someone. So maybe Ki-Hang and Yu Cheng, you guys can show what you made, because since you're working together.
We also encountered some technical difficulties at the beginning.
There were questions too, and Jackie was very strict. Like I had to put questions in the thing. So yeah. Like even if the thing didn't work, you could answer the questions.
Oh yeah. We prepared some question. So like the question we think about is, I can share the screen. Yeah, as for the first question, we are thinking about that automation of intelligent labor, and that can how they impact the agency of the individual designer. And we would say that it's kind of unexpected and speculative experience that made of the era of recognition and automation. which illustrates the dynamic balance of agency between the designer and artificial intelligence. And so that is the collaborative authorship between the two to create unexpected moments in a certain design frame set by the designer. So yeah, that is what we are thinking about, how the automation can impact the agency in the creative production. Yeah. Kian, you want to go the second one?
Wait, I think it's go over because how to invest the labor.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think is like worth, just discussing relative to that, like your first response is, and what I was trying to get at in the statement and most of the lectures I give, right? Like there is no like objective, detached AI somewhere, right? Like some omnipotent AI, like it's all designed by someone with some agenda. So when you say that you're changing the dynamic balance of agency between the designer and artificial intelligence, what you're actually saying is you're changing the balance of agency between a designer and another designer, right? Like someone designed that system. And I think this is important to always kind of recognize this. Like, why I was talking about like, the kind of traps that are inbuilt within the agendas of the types of research and types of models that are put forward. Right. I think it's pretty critical to always understand that there is no like AI that's like some totally detached, unbiased thing floating out in the world, right? Someone designed it. In any software package that you're working with, someone designed it with intentions behind it, right? Like sometimes super overt, like in the case of the the Revit, like we were talking about with the Autodesk sales rep. Other times they're more, these biases or agendas are maybe less understood even by the people who designed them, but are more embedded by the kind of context in which the software was made, right?
Yeah.
There's certainly incidental consequences to designing something that can't, like even the designer themselves has no like full oversight of everything they're producing, right? But I think that's worth thinking about. Like, it's like one of my least favorite things in studio is when like the students say, and then the script did, or then the AI did. Like, okay, like we usually when it's in the script, it's actually when Casey did, because I gave him a script that I wrote to do, a thing in a specific way that I wanted it to do, right? And I think this also is a good way of you reflecting on your agency in the process.
Yeah, I think that this comment is super interesting but I think there is something a little different between like Casey did this coding, but I think how Casey did this coding is intention to make a logic to make them self-iteration, but those self-iteration is kind of the loop and you cannot predict it. I think that moment is interesting for the creative production. Yeah.
Where the gaps are in intention.
What?
That might be an interesting way of rephrasing this, right? Like, where are the gaps in intention between the different agencies that are produce this workflow, right? So basically what you're saying is like inhabiting that space that I didn't anticipate in the production of it, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe, maybe is we really know how the script can do like the loop, and they can make the iteration by themselves in this a single logic. So when the iteration become a million times, we start cannot to predict how it can make the image look like. So that is what I'm talking about, the unexpected experience or the unpredictable image making. We are using the coding or the scripts to do. Yeah. And
so I think then you want to think about the applications that would cause that to happen, right?
Yeah.
And certainly like anytime you engage the kind of computational power of the kind of exterior world, so the model that you've made, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
These kind of unexpected results start to occur, like because you haven't accommodated for everything that it could see, right? There's blind spots.
Yeah. So I
think
that
there's something interesting here that you could latch onto about kind of, what are the contexts which essentially the kind of application of a script or a model in a way that purposely puts it in a place where it sees its blind spots, but that you still feel like it has kind of value, right?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to break the software, right? But where does breaking the software still have value? It's the kind of difference between the kind of glitch project and the data bending project, which came a bit later. Glitch was purely about curating errors in software. As a kind of anti-Microsoft project, or IBM project, right? But then it's like, okay, now that we have these errors, how can we imply them with some intention or with some idea about producing value in and of themselves? The initial glitch project produced value just by representing the shortcomings of corporate software production. But yeah, that's a longer thing.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, sorry, I do have another question though. It's about the biases, because although we train in this model is like do we actually want to eliminate the biases in this training, or we just keep it as a sort of authorship we have?
That's up to you. I would say that you can't eliminate bias, but you can kind of recognize you can start to recognize where it is. If that's your agenda, or you could just be like purposefully looking to kind of build a tool which is allowing you to scale up your production, right? To allow you to kind of project your agenda over a larger scale, which is kind of what these tools are really designed for ultimately.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting question for me, because when we use these tools to generate our architecture project, it actually kind of give access to all people, like the entry-level people or a real architect, to do the same thing simultaneously. Like, I don't know if that's a good thing or not, because as an architect, you do something like a creative and have your own authorship, and it's like recognizable for other people. But actually with these tools, other people, like a normal guy, even doing like a journalist, can generate the same thing with you. So
yeah, that's why you need to copyright your software.
So it's like
I'm kind of joking.
Right now we're not an architect anymore. We're like a software designer instead of doing the architect.
So when I was a kid, I'm super old, right? Like you used to have to go out in the sand and draw a circle and like locate the stars and then start piling blocks in a specific way to make a building. Then it changed it. Then you used to have to do drafting, and then BIM came along. What I'm saying is, like, what architecture is not a static thing, and like you have to be comfortable evolving with it, right? So absolutely, I would argue that to do the things that the level of agency that we ascribe to the architect in terms of putting things out in the world for the built environment, moving forward, you absolutely should be able to write your own software, because there's other agencies that are becoming involved with these transitions as well, right? Like architecture is low overhead, or is high overhead, it's like low margins. So the kind of energy to invest in technology for accelerating things in the building industry rarely comes from architecture offices, right? It's always about kind of subverting it. Like the digital didn't come into architecture through Columbia's paperless studio, right? It came in the 80s for large industrial companies, or if you look at the kind of the steel engineering for the World Trade Center, like these are all digital projects before the digital project happened in the 90s, right? So all this is to say that they're like, yes, that's what you're saying. I agree with that position, that in the future, the architect will be the people that are designing the platforms for production of architecture, which, yeah, life is hard. But there's always going to be like I feel like there's always going to be like a Peter Zumthor or something. Like he's like the kind of Williamsburg chocolate bar version of architecture, or like something like that. Like there's always going to be people that are going to want to spend extra for someone to like pile sticks up one at a time, burn them out of a concrete, formwork, right? Like there's some value there in the kind of individual craftsman project, right?
That's exactly
think-
something we want to explore in the thesis, actually. But we
Yeah,
will keep
most
talking about
architecture
it.
though will be
Yeah.
automated.
Yeah.
And so designing the software that does that automation is a good place to put agency.
Okay.
I used to go into my dad's office and there would be like this huge room filled with 200 people that sat on stools drawing the buildings. They were called draftsmen. They don't exist anymore. But that used to be one of the paths to being an architect, was you were a draftsman for 7 years, I think. And then you could be registered as an architect. That doesn't exist anymore. Profession changes.
Okay.
But that's fun, right? Otherwise
Yeah,
it'd be boring.
it is fun, but it's just remind me the reality and how cool it is. So
You
like,
got some time. Like architecture is really slow. The building industry is really slow. Like kind of, it's awesome to watch these guys come in from like tech and just run up against the building industry and be like, oh, like Katerra's bankrupt. These guys from Tesla have this like ADU company. I think they're from Tesla, and they're just like, you know, like in the pure state of frustration. Like, why doesn't anything work here? It's because we have the momentum of years of a really messed up industry. So it'll be a bit slower in architecture than other fields.
yeah, that's true. But thank you for the answers. Yeah, thanks for the answers. It's really a good direction for us, actually, because our thesis probably most likely related to that.
Yeah. We got like 10 years until the Wall-E future, right?
Yeah.
Fully automated luxury communism. Yeah, that's not gonna happen, sadly, because the alternative is worse. Okay.
Hey, on that positive note, let's go to the rest project.
Yeah, is Wall-E cautionary or aspirational? I feel like it's maybe aspirational.
Yeah, they have it pretty good, I think.
They got it good. Yeah.
Should I keep it positive or should I
It's totally up to you.
Okay. My mood, no, I'm kidding. So let me share the screen. So yeah, I generated the text from Bruno Latour's essay, one of the reasons why we feel so powerless. So it talks about idea of the disconnect, why we cannot understand the vastness of events that are happening around us. And the other quote was just more dumb. Because you wrote brutalism is bad, I was like, maybe I should write something that's good. And then the text came really fun. It was very like fast, like speed kind of, it didn't make much sense, but I would actually read a novel like that. It was really cool. It almost like felt like Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express, very fast. And yeah, here I started getting images like that on the disconnect with the catastrophe that we're facing, I guess, which is, I don't know, it looks weird. Then I just started writing random words in the thing, like Chungking Express, and you get a whiskey that they were drinking in the movie. So I'm not sure where you're getting this. I don't know how that works, but are you like sourcing that from Google, or I don't know, but there's certainly like stuff that is recognizable. It's almost like, you know, some kind of dreams that are like mashing. It's very surreal. That's probably his face in some extent. And then Wong Kar-wai is from Hong Kong. I don't know. It's really interesting. And then more random things like, I don't know, horse teeth or like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I don't know. It's funny. You see some singers, you know, in a very abstract, I don't know, appearance. And then maybe texts. What I was really, I have more questions in that sense. To me, like, a more interesting question is maybe how to actually interpret this kind of data and what to do with it, because it seems like you can generate like a multiplicity of aesthetics, imagery that one doesn't necessarily know, what do I do with it? Like, how do I mix it? Does it tell me something? Is there like a greater like truth in it? Like, I don't want to take them as that kind of a like idea, because I'm sure a lot of people would take AI in some sense very religiously, which is also a problem with sustainability if you take it in that way. And how does that investment of labor, energy, and capital, on that kind of a question, who actually owns the platform? Because if that's like the idea of like someone's being able to generate some sort of like imagery, but who created that technology, and who owns it, and who owns the platform, and who owns the space, and is the one that's like generating those images even aware that it's generating it for someone else, or that kind of like constructed reality in itself? That's probably like the thing that I'm definitely scared of in that sense. But at the same time, maybe it could like kill like systematic hierarchy that we have in the system. And about the opportunities, I was not very sure. I just said concrete certain processes which are part of the common workflow. But I would be happy to discuss these kind of questions if anyone wants to talk about it. Yeah.
Can you maybe talk a little bit more about your response to the first question?
The which one?
The first question?
Yeah, sure.
How does this invention of new aesthetics or visual concepts occur in your mind?
We do have some sort of connectivity with the reality in which we live, because we absorb all sort of imagery that we've been absorbing since we were born. But could a combination of all, because let's say you're only like living in a specific place for the entirety of your life, and you're kind of used to a certain cultural aesthetics that are present there, although you have this opportunity to see different kind of stuff on the internet, TV, and so on. But could a connection of all these different images just invent a new sense of aesthetics that don't even exist on this planet? I mean, I'm really over exaggerating it now, but why not? Because and how would the AI as such do that? Because it's still, as far as we know, I don't know, it's still probably constructed by us, right? Or it was constructed before us, and just, I don't know, that's the sci-fi already, and then just embodied us so she could, I don't know, like whatever, let's not go there. But this kind of but it has this kind of a potential, and I think it's interesting in that sense to give it a go. But again, what is the source? Who created it? With what kind of intentions? And is it still in control of it, or is it evolving and we don't even understand how? Like, how much do you control what you created and like gave us to work with? So that's a question for you, maybe.
How much do I control?
Yeah, how much do you control the entire?
What I gave you guys?
Yeah.
Very little.
Very little.
Yeah, I gave you guys open source stuff from OpenAI.
Yeah.
Like, they're the ones that controlled it, not me. Like, and again, like, these are not tools that I use in the office, really. Or when I do use them, like, we're always retraining our own models and things. So we have much more control. But there's always a gap, right? Like, we didn't invent the architecture. We might modify the architecture, but we're always kind of, responding to the intelligence that's embedded in it by others. But that, again, I don't think that's a novel problem necessarily, but maybe it's more overt here because the machines are so, you know, I think like in comparison to the kind of semantic AI that we're used to working with, like with the intelligent agent stuff, the overhead of production is so much higher that it does concentrate it into, like you're saying in the second paragraph, into kind of local platform, into like platform corporations or institutions, right? But it might also just be a cycle. Like I think we had this conversation with Casey Rios, who is an artist at UCLA, or is an artist, and he invented processing and stuff. And he was, you know, we were all freaking out about this, I think like 5 years ago at this panel, about how we're using these models that you basically, if you're not, you know, at Google or Stanford's comp sci, like you basically can't really operate on them the same way that we were used to with the semantic AI. And he kind of just calmly reminded us that when he was started doing that stuff in the 90s with his behavior catalogs, he used to have to rent time on a, you know, a 2-story supercomputer at MIT to do stuff that we do on our laptops now. So I think that's also a kind of cyclical thing. So I think that there is like a potential that these things become more accessible and more efficient moving forward. That kind of investment becomes lower. But certainly at the moment, it does seem to concentrate that intelligence and power structures that you're hinting at in the second paragraph.
I think that question from Yuri is extremely interesting also because it's maybe two or three questions at the same time, right? But I think the question about the meaning and this kind of power versus like powerlessness in the face of something like that, that's not easily described by saying, you know, that it's not a novel problem or something like that. I think it is a legitimate question, like, and maybe that's where the history of aesthetics really does help. I mean, Casey, you were talking about surrealist project and this idea that they were trying to kind of break some classical modes of thinking by introducing like automatic writing and, you know, things like kind of subconscious coming into the play and becoming a force and so forth. So I think, you know, there is something there which I think we might look into. But maybe to really answer that, it would take many different kinds of knowledge, right? Yeah.
I was also thinking a little bit about Elaine Scarry's discussion in her book On Beauty and Being Just, and the kind of ethical behavior tied to aesthetic value. If we sort of care about something enough to want to protect it and kind of maintain it, that it might mean that we start to behave ethically toward that thing. And she talks about the first time she really saw a palm tree, and she says, you know, I would always say I hate palm trees. And then she had this kind of encounter where she saw a very specific tree and became kind of mesmerized. And she said now when she says, I think palm trees are beautiful, she pictures this very specific instance and realizes that she used to just generalize. There was no real palm tree she was seeing. It was like a category of trees. And so I wonder, I don't know if that problem applies here, like the specificity of this multitude of, you know, images and text that we can produce. So when you were saying, you know, if you come from a certain culture and you're surrounded by kind of aesthetic qualities that you have been taught to value maybe, or, you know, to label them as this is a particular aesthetic, that what happens when that's disrupted by the presence of something new that kind of lands on your screen. And so I do think it's very tied to her discussion of the general and the specific. Like if you really look at something and immerse yourself in it and attempt to kind of apprehend it in a deeper way, maybe that's the moment at which you can begin to talk about applying an aesthetic value to it.
I think that there are like whether or not that the images that it makes are novel or not, these machines, I do think that this, like one thing that these types of models do is they create, I think, like a new, they expand a territory that is, let's say, under-described by aesthetic theory historically, right? And then that's thinking about the aesthetics of the multitude. You know, certainly it's something that's come up in like, Warhol and pop, or in architecture in the versioning project of the 90s, which I think Marcelin was firsthand there for, right? And so there is a gap right now, I think, in terms of having the proper discourse and actually describing or evaluating the multitude of production that these machines, like it's an inherent feature of them, right? It's what they're designed to do. And I think that's definitely a space that you could begin to look at in terms of novelty of aesthetics, even the fact that we don't really understand properly how to theorize the types of things and the kind of vast quantities of things that you can produce now with this tool, would be like one possible space. Like I think rather than evaluating each individual image, starting to kind of theorize on the collective output of your process or your machine. As an example, right? Like that's something that's like a feature of this mechanism that differentiates it from, like, the silkscreen press, is like the kind of variation that it can produce across that scale of production, which even differentiates it from the kind of force simulation, soft, was it blend shape tool or soft body tools that I used to mess around with when I was a kid in Maya.
Yeah, there was a debate once between Peter Eisenman and Greg Lynn, and the whole stopping problem discussion, that at what point you generate, I think they were talking about the embryological house, and Peter was like, how can you say that each one of these is kind of the same for you? There's no correct one, because as he was trained aesthetically, you would evaluate and say, this is the best one out of all these things I've produced, this one works, this is the one I'm going to develop. And then Greg was arguing, no, they're all equally, everything's slightly different, but they're all kind of on a flat, no hierarchy between them. And I remember them like really arguing about that. And Peter was like, this is impossible. But so now I think it's gone onto a whole another level, as you're saying, Casey, like the body of output itself.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting is like that versioning, right, like takes place in the space of the kind of the perfectly sealed model, right? Like it's, a super abstracted model that's it's kind of autonomous within its own domain. But like a lot of the tools that we're working with here, like, are all designed to encode something external to itself. So even though it's producing a multitude, it's not producing infinite variations. Like you feed it the same word, it makes the same thing every time, right? So there's a I don't know what it means yet, but I think that there's a different, like a kind of new discourse has to happen than the one that built up around that project, simply because it's moved out of, I think, the kind of Eisenman-esque autonomy of form, right? Like these are all responsive machines to engaging some kind of external context. In some ways, like I think things like the style GANs, less so, right? Like their interface is a random vector that you can't understand, like it's 100 number vector, like it's just a random thing. But like stuff like this one, which is taking a text and always producing the same form relative to that text, or the types of models we work with in the office that take in like maybe topographical information and always produce a building footprint in relation to it. So it can produce a kind of infinite number of designs, but always in relationship to whatever context it's responding to, and an ideally like kind of I don't want to say expected, but there's a rigor to how it engages its external information, right? That's like potentially one new territory of this project versus the versioning one, because it's no longer about an autonomy of the system or an autonomy of the architecture. It is inherently contingent.
Do you think it's the from the basic level is already wrong to think that there's this, in terms of hierarchy, that AI is on top dictating everything below?
Yeah, it's dumb. Sorry,
What do
sorry.
you mean?
What do you? No, the AI is not on
Like
top.
this God sense of AI that,
No,
I mean,
not yet. We got time.
okay.
Yeah.
And
AI can do like really dumb stuff in specific spaces. I mean, it is kind of like GPT-3 is kind of interesting because it does. I mean, you can defeat a Turing test depending on how you want to describe it with GPT-3. Does that make it a general intelligence? Probably not, but maybe it's getting a bit ambiguous. But none of these things are general intelligences. They're all like things that we specifically designed to do a specific thing, you know, in a very narrow space. The chess playing AI isn't going to realize all of a sudden that the easiest way to win is to just murder the opponent, right? Like I can't do that. Like, so we're not talking about these general intelligences. All these things we're working with are narrow intelligence. So that means that there has to be some hierarchy on top of them to produce them and allow them to operate.
Right, but it seems to be, I mean, at least from today's conversation, it really seems to be that we are using models designed for very specific tasks to do something else. Right? And that's, I think, an interesting.
Yeah, but again, it's like something that's tied very directly to like that. Like I was saying, like there's kind of different ways of trying to engage these models, and that's definitely one of them, right? And that's something that my office does, is kind of misusing models. But that's also tied very directly to, you know, like Triforma and BIM pre-existed the paperless studios at Columbia, but it didn't really take off until they started misusing, you know, movie software, right? Like software designed for cinematic effects, and trying to then turn that into tectonic buildings when that produces that cultural project. So like definitely misusing the tool is kind of a kind of really good built-in strategy, right?
Great, fantastic conversation. Maybe let's go to the next student and we can just keep responding. I think many of these questions will be.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jure. Yeah. Great. Who's next, guys?
I have a question I want to ask. So, like, from all those, I'm thinking about the images for all those results we already seen. There seems to be a certain style that is following. I feel like it's very highly saturated, and then it seems like several images overlapping with each other and kind of blurred. I wonder if that's something that like the designers put into the program to simplify it. So it's kind of directed actually from the beginning.
Yeah, did any of you guys try any of the other V2GAN clip platforms? There's a billion of them right now. Not a billion, there's probably like 100. Some of them you have to pay for on your phone. But they all have, there are kind of variances on that composition. Like the ones that, I was trying to find the one that Carnation used last year for her thesis project. And it does that kind of quilting of images like in a much more extreme way than this one does. But this one I think is attempting to do like kind of foreground and middle ground stuff in the way it's structured. But yeah, someone designed how it was doing that kind of scaling. There's like a, like even if you go like a deep dream, which was like the kind of thing that was like the first image network to kind of get real exciting on the internet or kind of ruin Instagram for a little bit. You know, like there's in the code that was put out by was it Alexei Mordetsev? I'm messing that name up. You know, it had this octaving thing that would like specifically scale and zoom in different ways across the composition that he designed into. So yeah, this one has a built-in kind of scaling thing that's happening that's creating that foregrounding and backgrounding.
You know, even like something like Art Breeder has like an idea of different genres behind it, which I think is interesting and related to what Casey was talking about, this idea of design by the multitude, right? Suddenly you, on that scale, you can observe kind of different genres and you can actually kind of reproduce images based on that genre as well. So it's not always, it's almost like adding like an Instagram filter on top, right? But the filter is not just a color filter, but it's a genre filter, you know? So you can make like character faces that look like they belong in like World of Warcraft or something, right? So which is a kind of a specific genre of characters, right?
Also like compositionally, like I think there's like, you know, Damian's always has these great lectures about like the, you know, role of perspective in modeling and things. And if you look at the set that this is trained on, it's highly perspectival. Whereas if you use like the WikiArt set, you have this kind of, yeah, some of the work is perspectival, some of it is two-dimensional, some is, you know, it's got some Kandinsky in there, right? Which is like no perspective, right? And like ArtBreeder is fun because you can begin to conflate these different projective spaces into a same image, or attempt to, right? Yeah. And you guys can get there's a pre-trained network on WikiArt which can do similar things with this, but you can also train your own specifically to hybridize these kind of compositional strategies.
Actually, Kangshin, I thought you might show your work as well.
Sure.
Nice.
I didn't try a lot, but I just inserted for the text. I just inserted a quote from a book called Architectural Details, and then these are like the things they generated, and yeah, it's kind of makes sense, but not at all makes sense. And then there's certain kinds of like quotations or word.
It invents people.
Yeah, invent people for like all the things that they are saying. So it's kind of interesting. And then these are the images they generate.
Oh, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
What the hell? How did you get this? How did I share that with you?
What's wrong?
You didn't run it.
Oh, really?
Those are the ones I ran when I was trying to show it to my mom.
Oh.
That's a photo I took of an intersection on Broadway and near my office when I was building. The Beast was originally trained on 10,000 images of downtown LA, so I could own the rights to the model. And then immediately lost the rights by training it on like Damian and Marston's work. And then so I did a quick thing where I said, I think it was something like dinosaurs walking down the street, and I preloaded this image in.
Oh, I see. I was wondering, like,
you forgot to press play.
Oh, okay. I see. Yeah. But
Let me go back up to
have fun. Yeah.
The text a second though. I think it's quite interesting, the rhythm that gets built up and the kind of rhetorical. There's something kind of expected in terms of rhetorical response, right? Like there's like a rhythm that's starting here. Like says the first is the omission, then the addition, and then substitution. Like it starts to get in this rhythm with these ellipses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It puts the in a bracket for some reason. Oh, probably because it learned some stuff where when you put the ellipses in, right, like you're abbreviating a quote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Does it reproduce like the architectural text cadence that you normally see? You know, if you read something like log, there is a certain way of writing that is kind of favored by the editors, I guess.
So,
I think
you went mute for a second.
I think you were stuck for a second.
Oh, something's happening with my Zoom. I'm sorry. It's fine.
Yeah.
It knows we're talking about it.
Yes.
No, I think that's pretty interesting. Like
say a lot, like in the generation.
And you miswrote the ellipses, right? Like ellipses are usually 3 periods, and it can carry that forward.
Oh yeah, that's true. So they're trying to like imitate.
Yeah, so we did like again, like using these tools to kind of reflect on you know, as a way of kind of like looking back at our history, or like looking back at the precedents in different ways. Like I think probably the first neural net project at SCI-Arc, or kind of AI like project in this sense, was Kellen Cartledge's thesis a few years back, where he produced a this was pre-GPT-2, so this was Kellen PT, or it was a pretty crude transformer, but he trained it on like Brett Steele and Eisenman, and it would really quickly like latch on to the rhythms and things like these transformer models, right? And there were certain aesthetic rhythms to the language that it could identify very clearly. And as a kind of side product of producing this Instagram architecture critic, which got shut down because it was, you're not allowed to grab images from Instagram anymore with the API. So it doesn't work, because it was like, if you hashtagged architecture, grab your image and then write some text about it on its Instagram account. But anyway, you know, what that was like a big thing that became really interesting to. I remember like Todd Gannon became obsessed with the kind of reverse engineering of text that this machine did. Like it was returning kind of metadata about you know, the quantity of multi-syllabic words, or like different syllabic words within like Brett Steele versus Eisenman, the lengths of sentences, kind of number of characters per sentences, like these kind of quantified descriptions of the different rhythms with which these kind of theorists espoused their work with, right? To the point that that was what the machine saw as significant in the text. And I think that's what we're seeing here too, right? Is this kind of privileging of certain rhythms and kind of phrasings, for example, over actual understanding of meaning.
Yeah.
Similarly, like Case Miller, like was that last fall? Like we were doing a project with him on a research project of trying to understand the impact of different political pundits kind of statements on social media in different locations. So like looking at Reddit accounts that were about like local politics within like Austin, for example, and then evaluating like the probability of like each comment's relationship to like a verified user on Twitter. So like we used that because it was something that we could verify. Like we knew Kamala Harris put out this statement that said this thing, right? Or AOC, or Tucker Carlson, or big long list of people, Trump. And what was interesting was like in the early stages of the machines, like training and the development of the data set, it couldn't differentiate between like Trump and Elizabeth Warren or Ruha Benjamin. Like it thought that their work was like the same work. And it was because of there's certain linguistic techniques that are utilized, or not Trump, it was Tucker Carlson and Ruha Benjamin, which are ideologically completely different. But initially the machine couldn't differentiate between those two texts and group them together because they were more similar to each other than, say, the way an individual like those two posted to Twitter versus in like a journalist institution like the New York Times posts. So including those in the data set meant that those two were closer together than they were to something like the New York Times, which made it kind of a useless tool until we kind of refined it down. And eventually it got it so that it kind of, we were able just through the kind of an analysis of the texts and the way it was dealing with rhythms, separate them across an appropriate spectrum. So it did start to put them on like kind of opposite ends of what it was looking at. But it was interesting at first in the early phases that the kind of rhetorical devices that are used on social media by these different pundits, even though they have, you know, theoretically vastly divergent views, were so consistent that the machine couldn't differentiate them. So it's, again, this goes back to like understanding where the biases are in any of these mechanisms. Like this one clearly biases rhythms and phrasing over understanding content, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which can be useful because you can now take a look at stuff that,
So the machine will kind of, when they see the sentence, it kind of choose to like go with the meaning of the sentence, or more about the rhetorics. Like they will kind of choose to go different ways. Is all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, it's like with the stuff we use for generating plans and things, like it looks at Campo Marzio without understanding an idea what a colonnade is. Like from architectural historical point of view, it only understands the rhythm of mass and void, which is something that then we kind of leverage very explicitly within our projects. Like it just knows on or off within a space and the proportional relationships there, right? So there's been a lot of projects around that, like the x degrees of x degrees of separation, and which is a kind of a speculative curatorial project done by Mario Klingman and Simon Dury, which allows you to kind of go through the collection, I think of the Met maybe, and find like new aesthetic relationships within the collection that you wouldn't through the kind of lens of art history, right?
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic, really interesting project, I think.
Mhm.
But I do agree with you. I think it's really the stage of AI. It's almost like a baby stage, right? The baby doesn't understand language, but it understands when someone is performing differently. So there is this like pattern recognition that is at the core, I would say. And content, really, I'd be curious to know if there are actual AIs that can respond to content and context and understand like meaning networks and structures and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's where like the kind of universalist approach is hurting, is because it's rooted in those universal deep structures ideas of language by like people like Noam Chomsky and stuff from the 60s and 70s. So like, yeah, privileging language structure over vocabulary.
Right.
That'd be an interesting project.
It is. I mean, it's also like a fundamental then question, like what is actually at the core, right? And there's disagreements also in that camp. Like people talking about structures coming from like formalist, kind of Russian formalism, and this idea that they're kind of shared structures between different stories. And I know that there was some GPT-3 kind of works that were dealing with this problem of like learning, let's say like fables or fairy tales, and that from everywhere around the world, obviously. And the thesis is that they all kind of share similar structure. And that was kind of proven by Shklovsky and others. So, but I think the question is really also, sometimes it's like, they learn the stuff that you were talking about right now, the cadence and the way of talking and the rhetoric devices, or are they really kind of like learning structure or meaning in some ways? And I think it's fascinating to think about this because sometimes we can conflate the both, obviously, also, right? As in your like political example. Great. So maybe we could move on to the next project. I think we have time for like one or two more.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, my Zoom is really crashing all the time. So I don't even know if I'm still talking to you guys. I hope I am.
You are.
Okay. There's no way to know for sure.
There's no way to exactly. Very European. This is what I wanted to also tell Jure. That's a very European line of reasoning that you're following, this kind of deep questioning of life.
I mean, I can't get away from it, even if I try.
That's all right.
So there is also something that I was reading, this idea of like hyper reading. It's introduced by, I forgot the name, but I'll send you guys a link. It's kind of the opposite of close reading, which I think was like dominant in architectural criticism. Maybe Marcin, you can, of course, tell us more about like close reading, but I heard about hyper reading and it seems to be the exact opposite. It's like you don't go deep in the text, but you look at like 1,000 texts very briefly, and you're trying to kind of almost look for patterns and create like some kind of almost like becoming like an AI yourself in some way.
Well, there was a time also where speed reading was kind of very popular, at least in the US, I think in the, maybe that was in the late 70s. And they would have these speed reading courses, and it was really just about absorbing. And I was reading the other day that contemporary students now are doing that with like online lecture content, I think it was at UCLA or USC, they were saying like a lot of students are playing the content at double speed and seeing what threshold they can still absorb so that they save time. And it's just like internalizing knowledge, which I also find like very scary in a way, as opposed to the closed reading, which is like a slow engagement, you know, an intertextuality where you're really looking at different texts, how they relate to one another, how their meanings might intersect, and you're sort of like digging deep, as it were. And that was always privileged. And sort of the thought was that rather than being superficial, it was good to dig deep. And I think what you're suggesting, Damien, is now the hyper reading is, you know, maybe we attach value to that more than digging deep, scanning broad. And
right, but it could be also inspired by AI in some ways. There sometimes happens that I mean, this happened in the 90s with the digital. Suddenly, the discourse became modeled in some ways around some the topics. Right, you mentioned this idea of like, where do you stop and how do you know what is the right model? And maybe like Casey's talking about this idea of like the authorship of the multitude, which is, I think, exactly opposed to like a historical idea of the authorship. So, but it's interesting that AI doesn't only work as a technical device, but it also works as a conceptual new way of seeing things. And maybe that's like hyper reading. It's not only training AI to see things, but training yourself to become, to start seeing the world as AI does. And that becomes this kind of like new model. So, but yeah, someone should show their work before we get into deeper in the rabbit hole.
I posted 2 images, like one by accident. But there's like one that's like, it's kind of interesting about, you know, it's, so the one that's a screenshot, like not the weird face. The weird face was where we tried to project a chicken into the Flickr face data set, and it actually made that face. But there was a tutorial from Friday. But the other one is applying the same logic, this transformer logic that's using the text to image completion, right? And like showing like how, you know, it's like the kind of this privileging of rhythm at the level of image actually results in content that's different, and the kind of the GANs that we use are privileging this interconnected relationship of neurons, whereas these are just sequential. So I think it's just a kind of interesting thing, just graphically or aesthetically, for us to look at in comparison with some of the stuff that like the VQ GAN makes or the style GAN makes, and how it might differ. And I think at a certain level it doesn't. Like it requires some kind of close reading, I think, to really start to differentiate what the actual consequences of like a rhythm-based image production versus this interconnected pattern-based or feature-based image production would actually differ. Anyway.
Yeah, I think, I mean, related is also like, there's a text that we both like to quote to our students, this no scope.
Yeah.
And that's where, I mean, they're talking about this idea that it's really, it's not, as you say, it's not a general, in any way, kind of this idea of the general AI, but it's really a pattern recognition statistical model that we're talking about. And maybe one thing that happens still is this idea of, a lot of times it happens like some kind of mythologizing or some kind of hyperbolic assigning of the certain properties to what these tools, right? And I think it's much more interesting actually to kind of unravel those and say, okay, so this is a statistical model. It's a pattern recognition device, and let's see what the real implications are for labor and for this idea of like, how do we work, as you were showing in Revit. And, you know, I'm certain there will be an app in the next 3 years, or where people are, you know, this is an AI design space, and you're going to design buildings through AI.
Yeah. Hypar is another company that's kind of trying to get into that. We'll see if they fail too. But yeah, that's a new reality. So, what are the projects around that? Subverting it in the way that the paperless studio did to the, just automating steel factories and skyscrapers that Bentley was really good at, and the Bentley and Dassault, mostly Bentley. Dassault was a little bit too fancy, but we're really good at in the late 80s. Well,
great. Okay, so maybe
I'm on the clock till 12:30, but
oh, I think it's perfect. We can just finish here.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone. And thank you, Casey and Marceline. It was really great to participate in the conversation. Thank you to the students.
Great to see you guys.
I have a final quick question. So so I'm real interested in the feeding the AI generator with my images that were just discussed with you. So can you, if you have time, can you share some tutorial or like how to pages to us that we can manipulate and to create our customized AR generator?
Yeah. See what we got here. These are pre-trained. Here you go. There's a section here on training.
Thank you.
Apophenia is a big thing. We didn't really talk about that too much, but that's a fun thing.
That would require a whole session, I think.
Yeah. That face with the thing, like, Sardi, my student in Architect, she freaked out because she realized that she thought it looked like her. With this act of apophenia, and so she was like, I'm a hybrid of a chicken and a dog, which was the other thing we fed the thing. Yeah, but that's just, apophenia is like a whole other project. You guys can read about that. Cool.
Thank you. Happy Chinese New Year.
Happy Chinese New Year.
Exactly. What is it? Shinyi Kwaila? I've murdered that. I know. I'm sorry. Right. Jiang's like, yes, you destroyed that. That's not how you pronounce it.
You pronounced right. You pronounced right.
Oh, thanks. Very, very kind. All right. Let's see you guys soon.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.